Now I would like the head of the department to start the meeting with few words.
Thank you, ma'am. And good evening. This is Surat Giri, Head PG Department of English, Government Autonomous College, Rourkela. I feel privileged to have the opportunity to address all of you in this grand evening. In fact, morning for our speaker, ma'am. Our esteemed principal, sir, Dr. Vijay Kumar Behra, sir, I welcome you and thank you for pushing us all this while, which has resulted in culminating such a wonderful evening that we are about to witness in a while. With great honor and immense gratitude, on behalf of all the staff and students of Government Autonomous College, Rourkela, I welcome the person to whom to listen to. In this evening, we all have been waiting all this while. Professor Madam Vicki A. Hale, English Language Fellow, U.S. Department of State. Ma'am, we welcome you. Ma'am, we are even more grateful that you neither have cancelled nor postponed the event, even if you are sick. That is, and all the respect for you, ma'am. And ma'am, Anita Chen, the convener of this wonderful event, who deserves all the credit and applauses. All the staffs, students, intellectuals all over the globe present over here in this virtual platform. Government Autonomous College Rourkela welcomes you to this evening of wisdom and intellect. As the most open of the departments, the English department of Government Autonomous College Rourkela has organized the webinar on language, culture, and literature to take you to new aspects, avenues, and ideas on the interrelationship between language, culture, and literature. So without wasting much time, let's move on to the address by our esteemed principal, sir, followed by our speaker, Professor Hale, to unfold for her wisdom to unfold and for which we are all waiting for. So thank you. It is all now to our principal, sir, for the address. Sir.
Good morning to Madam. Good morning to Madam Vicki, Hale, speaker of this webinar, and good evening to all. I welcome on behalf of Government Autonomous College Rourkela to all this one-day international webinar on culture, language, and literature. The world is terminated and hit hard by the deadly pandemic. People around the world are struggling for their life. At this juncture of time, when the flow of knowledge and the world is threatened to come to a standstill, we as the smartest of the creatures have found ways and have to get right the situation. We are connecting and collaborating like never before. Today is one such opportunity to hear from a great intellectual, Madam Vicki Hale. I welcome her to this webinar to enlighten my students with her knowledge. Welcome, Madam. I also welcome participants across the globe, faculty members, and students to enjoy this evening with us. Welcome to all again. Thank you. Now, I call to HOD Surat Giri to preside this meeting and convener Anita Jain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for always being with us. Your cooperation has inspired us to go ahead with this webinar. I, Anita Jain, would take the honor to introduce today's speaker, Madam Vicki Ann Witt Hale. Madam is a virtual English language fellow with the US Department of State, also teaching at St. Joseph College for Women in Vishakhapatnam since August 2019. She holds an MA in teaching English to speakers of other languages and world language education from the University of Georgia, as well as Bachelor of Science in Business Administration. In addition, she has earned a master's specialist certificate in teaching English to speakers of other languages. Madam taught English as a second language for 5 years in the US to adults at several private language schools, where she covered 4 skills work, integrative language teaching, as well as test preparation and pronunciation work. She also has several years of experience in one-on-one context, working with global corporate clients, both online and face-to-face. Previously, Madam has spent 11 years in Russia with her family, 2 of which were teaching English for specific purposes to university students in Perm, Russia, and another year as freelance instructor at high schools in Siberia. Embedded in her teaching philosophy are communicative competence and communicative language teaching, focusing on the elements of authentic assessment and cultural awareness. She believes students need to build on their experiences and appreciate all they have learned and done. Madam, I welcome you to this webinar, and I request you to start over with our today's topic, culture, language, and literature.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. I am so happy to be here. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude, first of all, to Dr. Principal Bijaya Kumar Behra, and to the English department head, Mr. Surat Giri. And also,
I request everyone, please mute your microphones.
Yes, I muted them. Okay, that's fine. I don't want to be distracted from thanking our special convener, the one who attended one of my webinars last year and challenged me to speak on one of my favorite topics, culture, but also to combine it with my love of language and literature. Anita Jain, thank you. You're an inspiration, by the way, in your quest to maintain being an educator while also being a new mother. You're welcome. Thank you. I also just want to take this moment to introduce someone. I don't even know if he's here present, but I want to mention his name now so that I don't have to mention it in the middle of my presentation. Dr. Z.N. Patil. He is currently the president of the Pune chapter of English Language Teachers Association of India. And he was also a former professor of English and former head of the Department of Training and Development at English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. And the reason I want to mention him now is because he wrote a paper that I encountered probably earlier in the year, the beginning of this year, when I was putting together a curriculum for a cluster group at St. Joseph's College called Culture, Language, and Literature. Well, so I encountered his paper and I quoted him several times, and I wanted to quote him today. So I will mention him now, and you'll know who he is when I come to his quotations. But later I'll tell you that the name of his paper was Culture, Language, and Literature, and it had to do with the international interaction in order to accomplish communicative and cultural competence. And so thank you, Professor Pato, for your inspiration as well. And so I'm going to be sharing today what is a 1.5 hour, well, 1 hour actually, because I want to leave time for questions and answers, a 1 hour version of my 6-week course on cultural language and literature. So I thought when Anita asked me what I wanted to speak on, I thought I would really want to take this idea and turn it into a seminar, because it's such a merging of concepts. But I had no idea how difficult that was going to be. So I have been working earnestly on it, especially the last couple of weeks. And there are some topics that I will not be able to expand upon, but I'm going to mention today. So don't be frustrated. I'll give you some resources that afterwards or during the next few days, if you're interested in those topics, you'll be able to have a resource to look for. And you'll also be able to, I'll be happy to give you my email address if you have any more questions that we can't answer at the end. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. Let me show you my agenda for today. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? All right, great, thanks Anita. All right. So, this is my introduction, and this is the name of Dr. Patel's paper that I will be referring to. Sorry, I forgot I made that into a slide. Okay. All right, so here's my agenda. I'm going to begin in just a moment with a little of my cultural background. It's an updated poem. I wrote a poem back when I was working on my master's called I Am From. And I use it in many of my classes, especially English for Employability and Culture, Language, and Literature, for students to write their own so that they can get an idea of the culture that they have really come from. And I am going to read you my poem when we begin. Then we're going to go on to elements of culture. There are many, as I'm sure you are all well aware, so I want to bring them to the forefront of your mind as kind of a backdrop. An overarching theme as we talk about cultural components of language and literature. There are many expressions and how they influence one another, how culture influences language and literature and vice versa. So let me begin then with my poem, because I want you to know what has influenced my thoughts, my teaching, and my views. I wrote my first version, as I said, when I was working on my master's, but I thought for this class, I needed to update it. So this is my current version of I Am From. I am from military bases, schools every 3 years, sibling rivalry and differences unnoticed. I am from casseroles and French bread, tacos and black beans, escargot on the Champs-Élysées, borscht, masala, and plof, ants in my coffee. I am from Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan, and Joan Baez, Janis Joplin, and Helen Reddy. I am woman, hear me roar. I am from When in Rome, do as the Romans, do unto others, and never met a stranger. I am from Following Jesus, growing and welcoming change. Age has no meaning, and all people matter. I am from over half a century of learning from mistakes and appreciating diversity. From discovering new methods of teaching, new frontiers to explore, and new chapters to create. These new frontiers and new chapters have a lot to do with language, my love of languages, and most of them I have learned in the context of the culture. So let's look at culture as the superglue holding elements of language and literature together. Let's look at language and literature in the light of diverse culture. They are not I don't believe, three distinct roads merging. So let's see if I can paint a different picture for you. What is culture? What comes to your mind when I mention the word culture? So many different things, probably, so many that we wouldn't have time to even list them all. But I really like the Peace Corps website definition: a system of beliefs, values, and assumptions about life that guide behavior and are shared by a group of people. It includes customs, language, and material artifacts. These are transmitted from generation to generation, rarely with explicit instructions. And so we see this evolving going on with culture, always changing, dynamic. I like this wheel. The wheel shows that it is something that has no beginning and it has no end. It's not linear. It doesn't progress from one stage to another, although it does change. In fact, it is almost multi-dimensional. It has length and depth and breadth. It is seen and unseen, and even unraveling, while at the same time woven. But for the moment, let's think of culture as something that unites people. Let's stick to two dimensions of culture. And I'm sure you've seen this next picture before. If you haven't, I'll put it on the screen for a moment of contemplation. The visible part of culture that is above the surface, that we see so clearly: language, behaviors, physical characteristics, some heroes maybe even of our culture, and some rituals that are performed. And then there are the under the surface cultural findings, like values, beliefs, perceptions, social status, which sometimes is seen, sometimes not, political views, which people hesitate to talk about, preferences, favorites, and as I mentioned earlier, assumptions. Now, these things may manifest in different ways. They may be demonstrated, but they are not always seen. And just by looking at this list, we can imagine the diversity of these items, even within what might be considered one culture. So I wanted to start, I thought this would be a great starting point of appreciation. How can you and I and all of us support cultural diversity? I put a short list together from a couple of universities in the United States, Purdue and Georgetown University, which is the university that works very closely with English language fellows. First of all, increase your level of understanding about other cultures by interacting with people outside of your own cultures, like you're doing today. Meaningful relationships may never develop simply due to lack of understanding. Avoid imposing your values on others that may conflict or be inconsistent with your cultures. When interacting with others who may not be as proficient in English, recognize that their limitations in English proficiency in no way reflect intelligence. That's one of the first things I teach my students in communications class, is to never base your opinion on someone by a single story of their lack of English or some other story you've heard. Recognize and understand that some concepts within the helping profession in families, gender roles, spirituality vary significantly among cultures and influence behavior. Advocate also within the workplace, within your educational setting, even a clinical setting. The use of materials that are representative of various cultural groups. I'll talk about that later when we look at textbooks and other materials. Intervene or point out in a situation that is appropriate when you observe others' behavior being insensitive or biased or prejudiced. Be proactive in listening, accepting, and welcoming people and ideas that are different from your own. In other words, you go into any situation with the idea that you can learn something from them. Another thing that I teach in conversation and interview skills. And finally, what's something else that you're doing today? Take time to understand the cultural elements of both language and literature. Be active in fostering growth. Now, what does this mean? Be active in fostering growth. I think you first have to understand the word culture comes from a French term, which in turn it was derived from the Latin word colere, which means to tend to the earth and grow, or cultivation and nurture. So I think it's really important for us to be thinking about culture as a characteristic of a particular group, but also to go a step further, and I learned this from the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition, then that defining culture as shared patterns of behavior, as the Peace Corps definition claimed, interactions, understand that these are learned by socialization. And that is something that we learn when we're learning language, when we're teaching language. Socialization, not isolation, is where these things develop and are shared. Thus, it can be seen as the growth of a group identity, fostered or promoted by social patterns unique to the group. Now, let me give you an example of that. And it can be found in the United States, where there is a huge population of immigrants, and they carry with them an identity from their home country. And it can be seen in the United States, but it changes as they assimilate into this new culture. They still maintain those things that are important to them, but they take on and try to understand new elements of culture. I saw a movie not long ago on the airplane about an Indian family whose children were born in the US. I think it was called The Namesake. If you haven't seen it, you must see it. Brought tears to my eyes at the end. But there were certain social patterns that were unique for them that their parents carried over. But then these children who were born in the United States, they weren't at first so keen on them, but began later to appreciate their culture. So you can see these changes take place as social groups change in their own different environments. So we grow, back to this idea of growing, we grow in our learning of language and literature when we incorporate culture into our ideas, into the concepts and the backgrounds and the environments and surroundings. Okay, when we incorporate culture, when we speak and teach and learn language, as well as when we learn about literature, we grow. So how do we incorporate the unseen elements of culture? I want to talk about that for just a few minutes, because it's harder than those ones that are seen. When I see something, but sometimes when I was living in India, and hopefully we'll be back soon to India, I would look out the window of my apartment and there would be parades or things, and I didn't understand what they all meant. So I saw this picture once, and it made me think of the best way to incorporate the unseen elements of our culture. We question, reflect, gain insight, which helps us to be more aware. So question, reflect. There's great benefits, by the way, in reflection. I could give you some statistics, but won't take the time right now. Reflection is a key element in any field. All right, so that makes, I want to talk a minute about hidden rules. Now, this is one of the first topics. I thought of leaving it out, But then I decided, no, it's too important to leave out totally, but I don't have the time, to show you these two videos, but I'm going to recommend them to you. But it's very important in thinking about language and intercultural communications as well as literature. Simply put, a hidden rule is a cue that lets people know whether or not you belong to the group. You either know this thing or you don't. And if you don't know it, if you break the rule, nobody usually tells you what you did wrong. They just look at you funny or they react. That happened to me once in my staff room at work when I used the word stranger. I said, nice to hear from you, stranger, in a WhatsApp. And it was not taken very well because there must be some hidden rule that you don't call people you know strangers, right? But in America, when we say, hello, stranger, it simply means I haven't seen you for a long time. So here's one of the first resources you can look up on YouTube, Rita Pearson. And this one is called, this one is called My Mama Said. Now I'm just gonna forward it to a number that I wrote down. I'm gonna play just 30 seconds of it so you can hear her talk about what a hidden rule is. Now she's a teacher and she's talking about elementary school students, but it's interesting to, let me fast forward it up to 1:15 here.
Body was kicked. And then he kicked my cousin. And my mama said, I said, stop right there. Because I knew we were getting into a big rule. The mama rule. You see, there's mama law and there's public law. No law overrides mama law. Did you know that? If you didn't know, that's a hidden rule you must remember. When your mama says it, it becomes engraved in stone. So I knew what he was going to tell me. I said,
so she had started out there by talking about two students who had been fighting. And then what my mama said, so this is a hidden rule. So I usually spend a full hour with my students on talking about hidden rules because there are hidden rules in families, hidden rules in society, hidden rules in certain nations. I mean, they get bigger, right? There are a lot of hidden rules in intercultural communication. Whether or not you have eye contact, whether or not you show that you're listening, what space you keep between people, tapping your feet or your fingers, interrupting, smiling. There are hidden rules that we need to learn. Hidden rules that exist in intercultural communication. Now, I'm going to talk about this more later, but I'll just mention here that hidden rules means learning nonverbal norms of a culture, learning to allow for silence, learning to look at various interpretations, asking yourselves, what assumption am I making here, right? Is there some hidden rule? And here's the saying, think with your eyes. This is what teachers say, think with your eyes, just as the Japanese say, read the air, right? Because some things are hidden, they are not always spoken. I'll talk about cross-cultural competence in a few moments. Now, there's one other person that I want to recommend to you who talks a lot also about hidden rules, and her name is Ruby Payne. She talks more about the hidden rules about money. So I took this chart from her website, and the source is written right down here, Ruby Payne and Framework for Understanding Poverty. Now, here's the thing to understand initially about hidden rules, and you can research it more if you want to know more. But when there is a topic, there are certain ways that different classes think about it. And I'll just take money for the example. The poor people think money is to be used, to be spent. When I have it, I spend it. When I don't spend it. That's my hidden rule about money. The middle class think that money is to be managed. You should have a budget. You should know exactly where your money's going. And the wealthy think that money is to be conserved and invested, saved for retirement or earning back interest or whatever. So there are other subjects, personality, food, time, education. There are hidden rules, are ways that we think about things that show that you are a part of a specific group. And if you're not, and so we learn these things when we're in the culture, but it's important to try to think of those things ahead of time when you're trying to learn about language. If you're teaching language, if you're teaching English and you're talking about money, you should talk about some of the hidden rules. That's how we incorporate culture into our different subjects. I personally believe that culture should be taught in English, math, science, history. Okay, so you get the picture about hidden rules, and you can do more research on that if you want. So yes, the last thing here, we have them by race, by religion, by socioeconomic class. There are, it's one of those, many of those unseen things. Now, so those are the two resources for hidden rules if you want to look into them. Now, finally, before we go on to language, I want you to remember the big C and the little c. The big C and the little c. The big culture and the little culture, all right? So normally, hold on, we just need to mute someone here. So normally, you would think of the big C culture as high culture and the little c low culture or pop culture, okay? So high culture, who are the great writers, artists, musicians, famous works, great moments in someone's culture's history, iconic works. And both low culture and high culture need to be thought of when we're thinking about language. Are we talking academic or are we talking normal everyday conversation? Low culture are such things as features of everyday life, pop culture, social mores, traditions. So here's my trivia question for you. Which of the following is not an example of an inherent cultural artifact? Think that over, unmute, and tell me what you think. Nobody's going to be brave. The answer is the internet. So the Berlin Wall, the bald eagle, Berlin Wall in Germany, bald eagle in America, Big Ben in London, those are all inherent cultural artifacts. When you think of Big Ben, you right away think, and we're going to talk more about that in language, words that are deeply associated with our culture, with our language and culture. All right, so let's move on to language, and then we'll tie all three of them together. Okay, culture. Language is defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as a systematic means of communicating ideas or feelings by the use of conventionalized. Rajdeep raised his hand. No? Yes, Rajdeep? Okay, maybe it was done by mistake, so I'll continue on. A systematic means of communicating ideas or feelings by the use of conventionalized signs, sounds, gestures, or marks having understood meanings by a community. Now, I chose this definition because there are so many elements that I really like about it. Communicating ideas, communicating feelings, using signs, sounds, gestures, and understood by a community. So that's there are so many elements of language that in order to understand all of those things, we have to incorporate culture. Now, remember that culture is fluid. In other words, it's very changeable and often vague, what we might say amorphous, or unfocused. But there's no mistaking that there is a connection with language and culture, especially where communities are concerned. Now, for teachers of language and for learners of language, it's recommended that they be taught together. Let me quote a couple of people here. First, Ned Seeley, who's the author of numerous books on culture and teaching intercultural activities. He writes, learning a language in isolation of its cultural roots prevents one from becoming socialized into its contextual use. Knowledge of linguistic structure alone does not carry with it any special insight into the political, social, religious, or economic system. So often when we're teaching a language or literature, we may mention some seen cultural aspects, but we neglect to try to bring in the unseen things, which help us understand why somebody says, "What's up?" instead of "How are you doing today?" Right? That's a very simplistic reminder, but you understand what I mean. According to Wilga Rivers, by the way, is an Australian linguist and author on teaching language. And she wrote, "We must focus on both appropriate content and activities that enable students to assimilate that content. Activities should encourage them to go beyond fact. And I want to say beyond translation. So often my students say, "Can I just translate that into Telugu?" And I say, no, because it may not mean the same thing. So we try to talk about its meaning first, so that they begin to perceive and experience vicariously the deeper levels of the culture of the speakers of the language. So we're trying to fuse together this idea of culture and language and how it affects society. Now, remember that culture has the ability to acquire new characteristics and forms because it is changeable, right? And groups that have one culture and they move together, they may, their culture may change. It's dynamic. Culture is dynamic. Its permutations can take place from one generation to another generation, from one geographic location to another geographic location. I think you see that in India when a student from one state goes to college in another state, and they are experiencing that as well. So therefore, culture should be combined with language, teaching and learning. I should have put teaching and learning in there because I know that today we have both students and teachers with us. Not isolating the language or the subject. Without culture component, learning is hindered. So choose a textbook or a section in a textbook and look for the cultural elements. How could they be better integrated? Okay, before you use that textbook, it's okay if you have to use that textbook, but look for cultural elements, whether it's in math or science or history, because they can show bias towards other cultures, and you want to be aware of that. And especially in language classrooms, language usually is taught in isolation. I know that I learned French in high school. French was my second language, actually, but then it was many years before I spoke it again. So then I took it in high school. Then after high school, I went to Switzerland and France. And at first, I could not even understand when I was asking the question, what do I wear? Or where do I live? Because I had been taught just the grammar, the lexicon, but without culture. And it was impeded. Now, I noticed that I'm going to stop my share just for a moment, because I noticed there's a couple of hands up. And is it a question that I should answer now or wait till the end? Rajdeep and Rajan Rutre have their hands up. So I'm going to go ahead and lower your hand if you don't have a question for now, but please save your questions for the end, unless it needs to be, if it needs to be answered right away, don't hesitate and interrupt me. Okay, so we can see those things, both Anita and I can see those hands raising. So, all right, finally, this is what I want to talk about next for a moment, lingual cultural teaching. So there were a group of Russian linguists back in the 80s that talked about uniting language and information that related to the culture. They called it lingual cultural teaching. So in the process of learning, the union of language and information relating to the national culture is called lingual cultural teaching. This is something else that you can resource, but I'm going to give you an example of what that is. Now, you will also hear lingua cultural teaching. I'm going to talk about that also. I don't worry too much about the names as much as the ideas. So this first idea is taking words, lingua, with the culture, and seeing the culture that's connected, united with that item. All right, so let's talk about that first. The lingual cultural, I'm going to talk about in the area of experiential learning. So the term lingual cultural component is used to denote the part of a language sign or word which reflects the nation's specific perception of reality. In other words, their worldview. And as a consequence, the cultural element of this or that language. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples in a moment, but I want you to see how that symbol or word or picture immediately draws somebody to the culture. Okay, so now this is different from cross-cultural parts which bear extra linguistic characteristics. For example, if I say apteka, which you and I in English would call pharmacy, in Russia, apteka denotes an institution where only medicine is sold. Pretty much in India also. But in the US, it's an establishment where not only medicine is sold, but you can buy chewing gum, you can buy products, paper products, beverages, so many things. It's almost like a mini grocery store, but you can also buy your prescriptions. So that's a little bit different than the lingual cultural component that I'm talking about. There is a author. This is a really interesting topic. And if you are interested in it, please look up these Russian linguists who have written on this. And this was actually, this particular one is in 2018. So it's still talked about even today. So here's the first of my 3 examples. This is my driver's license. My driver's license represents so many things. My driver's license represents the culture of independence, of law. If I don't have a driver's license, I'm not allowed to drive. It also represents like the coming of age. When I was 16 years old and got my driver's license, I was on the way to adulthood. Okay, so there are some cultural elements associated with this item, symbol. Then there's the Matryoshka doll. You heard Anita introduce me. I spent 11 years in Central Russia. And this Matryoshka doll represents the culture of children. They learn to count with these things. They go inside one another. It also represents the culture of folk art. Okay. Third, bangles and mendi, all right? So here are things that represent the culture of art, the culture of, I think, abundance. I mean, I used to take an Uber to my university when I was in person in India, and I would text my husband, oh my gosh, I forgot my bangles, because I felt like it was something really missing from me, and so forth. So there are immediate cultural messages that we see here and connect with these items. Now, this is a little bit different, but I don't really think that you have to worry about, is it lingual cultural or lingual cultural? It's all words connected with culture, right? But the first one that I was talking about is more about the item, whereas here we're talking more about the experience. Experience is connected to culture. When I left my high school and went to France and Switzerland, immediately I started speaking the language that I had learned because I was in the environment, I was experiencing it. And we learned certain words by experience. Now, I show this video to my students in my communications class because they love Friends, first of all, but it's also very cultural. and Americans use nonverbal communication a lot. And so I feel like they can connect with what they're learning with the experience. So let me just play the introduction to this for you because you'll enjoy it very much.
No one told you that was gonna be this way. Your job's a joke, you broke.
And you're the father, by the way. You got it.
Your job's a joke, you broke. Your mom lost you away.
No way to get him. I don't know. I'm telling you. I can do it.
It's a great video. I'm sorry, I don't have time today to play the whole thing, but you can find it also. Language is a system of meaning, and that system of meaning is based on our experience. Our understanding of language is largely intuitive. So if they can't experience, if they're trying to learn English in different settings, both American, Great Britain, Indian English, we want to put them in as many situations as we can while they're learning the language. And this is one example that I use. And also because the brain develops networks. Now, obviously today I'm not taking the time to talk about brains, but you can do a little bit of research on that. And then there are intuitive understandings of the different aspects of language and literature. Okay, so back in 1984, David Kolb came up with this experiential learning diagram. And that's what I'm talking about here, that there's some kind of a concrete experience. They reflect on it. Remember how important I told you reflection is for students and teachers. By the way, I belong to a reflective teaching group, and I really want to encourage teachers to reflect on their days, their teaching, and then active experimentation, and then abstract conceptualization, where they really make conclusions about what they have learned, the language that they're learning, whatever it is. So these are important elements of incorporating culture into our language and even into our literature. But language is more more current, more present, because it's something that we're doing every day. So if you want, if you're a teacher or even a student, this is one of the homework assignments I often give my students, but you can do this. Just consider some cultural artifacts and identify the cultural markers of these items. And how might you integrate this kind of culture-specific information into a more general lesson or learning of your language? Okay. Or use your academic setting, use your college, your university, and identify the unique cultural icons that mark it as individual. Walk around there someday and start to notice. I did that at my college, and it was so interesting to think of some of the different posters, some of the different statues that really marked them as individual and also nationalistic. Okay, so determine if they are permanent or ephemeral, temporary features of your home culture. And then think about how you would describe those things to someone who is a non-English, non-US born speaker of another language. How would you describe them? That's a really good exercise and challenging, because we're so used to using our own jargon and our own abbreviations and acronyms that the other person might not even understand what they are. So that's a good exercise. So just remember these important fundamentals, and that is that studying objects and phenomena of a particular culture helps you to see the world perception of a particular nation. So that's an easy way to incorporate culture and language. Before we go on to literature now, I know that you've heard of communicative competence. This was this term was coined by Del Hymes back in the 70s, I think. And it has, mostly to do with linguistic, social linguistic discourse and strategy competence. So we look at obviously the grammar, the vocabulary, the pronunciation, the social settings. And when we learn all of these things, we become more communicative because we learn how to correct errors or repair miscommunications. But cross-cultural competence has to do more with a psychological readiness to communicate. If you're a teacher and you're wondering whether or not your students are interested, perhaps there's not been enough cultural aspects brought up, because they become more interested when it becomes more real to them and more present, especially in literature, because they're reading something maybe that was written back in the 1950s and they're thinking, why do I have to know this today? But we know why, because of where it's going to take them, what they're going to learn from it, and they might become more interested if they're learning areas of culture. There's a certain level of verbal skills, language materials, and most importantly, the necessary amount of sociocultural knowledge of the spoken language. Okay, so this, again, is something I won't spend a lot of time on, but it is learning to be more competent in speaking and learning of other cultures as opposed to communicating on an everyday basis. Okay, so the main areas of cross-cultural competence involve cognitive, pragmatic, and motivational skills. Let me just mention those briefly so you're aware. So the cognitive goal is to obtain information about other cultures, get them interested, whether they're learning a language or they're reading some piece of literature. Pragmatic purpose involves the acquisition of practical skills necessary for intercultural communication. And then finally, the motivational terms are connected with the formation of the attitude of the student. Now, don't ask me at the end, how am I going to motivate my students? That's probably the most asked question any teacher trainer has ever been asked. And but we can talk about that at the end if you want to. But motivation is very important in learning cross-cultural competence. If they're not motivated to learn how to communicate with other cultures, it's not as easy. But most people studying language and literature are motivated. So let's remember that language and culture also form identity. Norton defines identity as how people understand their relationship to the outside world, how that relationship is constructed across time and space, and how people understand their possibilities for the future. So speakers use language in different ways to express various identities. Okay, so here we can especially see that language and culture are intricately related and dependent on each other. Language is formed by culture, while culture is influenced and impacted by language. So without language, culture cannot be completely acquired, right? Because we said it's passed on from generation to generation, even if it's not explicit. So it can be completely, it can be expressed or transmitted, and should be if it's going to be passed on. And without culture, language cannot exist. So back to the gentleman who I introduced at the beginning of my talk, and I think that he might even be with us now. But I introduced him at the beginning. I'll mention him again now. Professor Patel, in his paper, Culture, Language, and Literature, Developing Intercultural Communicative Competence Through International Literature. I think I have a typo there and I apologize. Okay, language orchestrates the culturally conditioned patterns of perception, attitude, and behavior of its community. So he's putting it in other words of some of the things that we've already talked about. And language is what orchestrates it, right? It's what puts it all together so that we can express our culture. We can talk about our perceptions and express our attitudes and behavior. It encodes these patterns through propositional, expressive, presupposed, and evoked meanings. So in order to better understand those meanings, we have to understand these two terms, cultural relativity and linguistic relativity. I hope I haven't simplified it too much, but I did try to simplify it a bit so that we're not spending too much time on it. I want to make sure to have time for question and answers. Cultural relativism is the ability to understand a culture on its own terms and not to make judgments using the standards of one's own culture. So if we have our culture, and obviously our culture is what's going to be at the forefront of our mind, but we want to make sure that we can set that back when we're being introduced to another culture and the things surrounding that new culture. It is an appreciation for cultural differences and the understanding that cultural practices, cultural differences and cultural practices are best understood from the standpoint of that particular culture. So if I want to continue to understand Indian culture, as I do, then I need to appreciate and look at their differences and their practices from their culture, not from mine. And so that's what I'm saying here. Linguistic relativity, also known as the Sarf-Worfman theory. I'm not very good at theories. I'm much better at putting things into practice. Anyway, linguistic relativity is the way people think of the world, which is influenced directly by the language that people use to discuss it. This sort of has to do a lot with our mental models, right? The filters that we see the world through. So in other words, the words that we have come from the way that we see the world. So we need to increase that perception so that our words are more relative to the culture that we're looking at. People's perceptions are relative to their spoken language. And this is a theory. Not every word in every language has one-to-one exact translation in a different language. That's why I tell my students, please don't translate the word as your first option. Okay, if you don't understand a word, let's talk about what it means before you try to translate it, because it doesn't always translate well. So we have to keep this in mind when we're learning new languages. All right, one final resource for communication, then I'm going to finish with literature. So intercultural communication aims to use the language in various situations around different cultures. So I want to introduce this book to you that I'm actually in the process of reading, The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. And especially if you are communicating with different cultures. It's very in-depth, and that's why I'm not spending a lot of time, but I do want to introduce it. It has helped me a lot in especially these first two, communicating and evaluating. Okay, because I found that the US is very low context and India is very high context. Japan is the highest context, right? That's where that saying comes from. I mentioned read the air. But India is over there too. So I had to learn that, that there might be things being said or implicit that I have to pay attention to, that I normally in America would be more direct. Same with direct and indirect negative feedback. Now, fortunately, Americans have gotten more towards the middle of the spectrum, but India is way over here giving very indirect negative feedback. And so I found when I first came to India that my direct feedback was hurting people's feelings. And I had to find new ways of talking about giving feedback to my students. I wanted them to know how to improve, but I also had to be careful of my choice of words. So Meyer wrote, what matters is not so much the absolute positioning of a person's culture on a particular scale, but rather their relative positioning in comparison to you. So we want to compare who am I talking with? And this is so important if you're going to be working in transglobal international teams, where I have some clients that I tutor, corporate business people who have a team made up of people from 7 different countries. And so it's very important in their line of work. Okay, so I want to go ahead and finish up now talking about literature. So language, okay, so hold on, language obviously affords us the opportunity to talk about many things, okay? But language is more than just oral communication, sorry. It is written as well as in our literature. So when we look for the intersection or the converging of these two roads of language and literature, of oral and written communication, what must be considered and what brings these two together is culture. Okay, so culture, and I want to give you another resource. I hope I'm not giving you too many resources, but it was very difficult to take my 6-week course and turn it into an hour lecture. So I had to just keep things in there that would be a resource. And but before I go to this resource, I want to talk about what literature is. Why do we need to study literature? And this is important because your students are going to say, why do I have to read this novel from the 1930s or the 1950s or even the 1980s? They want to, so you want to keep in mind the benefits of literature. I'm just going to go through them real quick here. First of all, I'm not going to play this. You can watch it if you want to. I'm going to summarize. Saves time, all right? Literature gives access to a range of emotions and events. So it's really a reality simulator and actually helps you speed up time. It makes you nicer because you see things from other people's perspectives, other people's points of view, and you can consider the consequences of their actions, not necessarily your own, right? It's definitely a cure for loneliness. My father always says, I'm never bored because I have books. It prepares you for failure, right? So you don't always have to be the one failing. It shows you others who have messed up. And it prepares you for the future. We tend to treat literature sometimes as just a distraction or entertainment. And although it might be those things, in a broader sense, it's like therapy, right? It's a tool to help us live and die with wisdom, goodness, and sanity. So those, I throw that in there to say that you will have students who start taking literature because they have to, but then they turn into students who are taking literature because they love it. So here's my resource. This is such a good resource for you teachers especially, because this was written by an Indian not too long ago, a few years ago, but it doesn't matter. What she gives are creative techniques of teaching literature. She understands the Indian classroom, and she has some wonderful ideas of using culture, language, and literature practically. So please, I'm just going to quote a couple of things from her paper because it will help you see why we need to incorporate culture. Literature contains various allusions, customs, manners, mythologies, and other details. They refer to various social, political, religious references. And sometimes you have to read the air. So if you don't know about those times, then there needs to be some study of culture in order to understand the literature more thoroughly, especially if it's foreign. To understand foreign literature, quote, you must know its context and background, comprehend the lexical items in the text that carry the thematic or context meaning in the piece of literature, unquote. And she says to, at the very minimum, be aware of geography and history. And I think that most of us probably do that well. When we're going to teach a novel, we talk about where it took place, a little bit of the history around it. But I think we have to expand that so that there is real significance, meaning to reading literature. So studying culture alongside literature requires interdisciplinary analysis. And that's where teachers often say, I don't have time to do that. But this is also where teachers can collaborate. So bring your, spend some time with your history teacher or your science teacher and find out some things from them and collaborate. They'll appreciate your lessons and you'll appreciate theirs. To better understand literature, look at historical themes and issues with an emphasis on different cultures. Okay. Also, you need to look at things from the perspective of gender, religion, politics, anthropology. And that's where this diverges, a little bit from the spoken language, because we're always taught we don't talk about politics or religion. But in literature, we need to do that so that we can view something from another perspective, a different worldview and world challenges. Words matter, as you saw in the language study, and the meaning behind words, whether literary or cultural, denotative or connotative, are really important. So Dr. Patel did talk about literature as a tool or the framework. So I want to hold on just a second. Yeah, I want to pull a few of Dr. Patel's concepts out of his paper and bring them into the light. It's a longer paper, and I do highly recommend that you read it. But I'm just going to pull a few of his out. First of all, because of the inseparability of language and culture, English teachers and learners can look at lexicon, idioms, grammar, and pragmatic properties of language and literature to discover their different cultural aspects. Just as looking at culture helps us to understand literature and language, vice versa. If language is investigated within the social context of the community that uses it, then literature must be analyzed and synthesized through the social context of the story as well. I thought this is really important. Now, we saw that when we looked at the Friends video. Now I want you to think of it in terms of, for example, the Scarlet Letter, right? A work of historical fiction by Nathaniel Hawthorne, set in Puritan times. That will mean so much more when we try to understand that community a little bit more. Linguistic resources are drawn upon, quote, to express different perceptions of reality. Okay, so we talked about that a little bit, but he goes on to say that literature, which is manifested through language, can only be understood and circumscribed by bringing it into a theoretical relationship with cultural and societal phenomena. This just emphasizes that idea of society that we're living in, society that was going on during those times, different societies of where we're speaking. So we can see the marriage of these three items. Now, he quoted in his paper, Tanuri Ojiadi, who is a Nigerian poet, an academic. He's won many different awards. And I think the quotation that he used really shows the different Englishes and the background that his English is coming from. So let me read that for you. Western universals crumble in the African worldview. Knowing my audience and deliberately not aiming at British or American cultural tradition, I emphasize content and meaning in my poetry. I write not to develop the English language, but to articulate ideas as clearly as possible. I do not follow English metric patterns. That is not relevant to my message. For me, English is the supra language on top of my own personal language. My writing, though in English, has its roots in Africa, not in England or North America. This really touched my heart and emphasized to me how if I'm reading something from a foreign culture, I need to try to understand. And we can do that so easily now with the internet. You know, I went and I listened to one of his interviews on YouTube, and it helped me to understand his poetry so much better. So culture influences literature, literature influences culture. And I just want to bring that up as my last point under literature, because it appears in all fiction books. Every setting has a societal influence. So I saw a Prezi presentation not long ago that helped me to realize almost this boomerang effect of culture and language and literature, influencing one another. Historical events, the occurrences around the book influence. So do distinct personalities. So think about Animal Farm, right? And the substitution of a conflict within a country to a farm and the characters to the animals. And culture of China in the Joy Luck Club, the Chinese mother-daughter relationship. And then finally, literature influencing culture, a book that documents an event may change a culture. For example, this is just a question, did Lord of the Flies by any chance bring about the Hunger Games? I don't know. All right, so as I looked over my list of concepts in literature that I have my students look at and try to interject culture, I thought about writing styles, themes, main ideas, plot, vocabulary, and vocabulary is often by theme, emotion, phrasal verbs, idioms, literary concepts, point of view, symbolism, metaphors, imagery, personification, the list goes on and on about literary concepts that have to be considered in light of culture, okay, especially metaphors. Patel in his paper reminds us that literature is often thought of as the seismograph of the society it portrays. And he said, think of what Shakespeare once said to his dark lady. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? All right, so summer, was he talking about summer in India? Not so enjoyable. Summer in Mexico, right now I'm in Mexico and it's pretty hot here every day. Or in England, so the culture here is portraying something different by using a simple word like summer's day, okay? So here's my assertion. If we too quickly apply the concepts of literature without an understanding of the culture, we will miss the transformational, transcendental meaning of the words. So don't be too quick to apply the concepts of literature without an understanding of the culture. So I have a couple of things to conclude with, and then we'll open it up for question and answers. I'm once again going to quote Professor Patel. Are you here today, Professor? He was here, and I'm honored to have him here. But in his conclusion, he said, the relationship between culture and language is like that between the reverse sides of a coin, right? Two sides of one coin, culture and language. The relationship between culture and literature is similar to that of a dance and a dancer. They're inseparable. As Larson Freeman remarks, gone is the notion of a homogenized language competence and a monocultural identity. In its place is the recognition that one speaker's resources overlap with others, but they are also distinctive. In other words, within unity, there is diversity. There is no more standardized language competence, no more cultures with one sole identity. There is overlapping and distinctiveness. May I be so bold as to suggest that culture, language, and literature are the dance, the dancer, and the music with an audience ready to exert interpretation.
Hi, Vicki. Hi,
Hello.
Vicki.
Hello, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have an excruciating toothache.
Oh, so everyone, let me just stop my finale here. This was my finale anyway. I just wanted you to see the music and the dance and the dancer all together, working together. This is Professor Patel. He is not able to stay. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your very explosive paper. I hope it continues to be instrumental.
Thank you very much, Vicki.
Yes, you're welcome.
I wanted to say something, but I cannot because I have a terrible toothache.
Do you want to type it in the chat?
I have already done that.
Oh, okay. So I will read it for you. He said, oh, the way people greet one another vary from culture to culture. For example, kissing lightly, symbolic kisses, hugs, handshakes, folding, join hands. Have you observed other patterns? I think that almost every country has this distinction of greeting, yes. Let's go ahead. So did you see enough of my dance? I had my husband just do a small excerpt of this dance. I thought it was just a beautiful picture of what I wanted to paint for you, this combination of music. Let me just go back to it just for a second. I want you to picture culture, language, and literature all together here. That's so beautiful. I didn't want you to miss that. So that's my picture of culture, language, and literature working all together. Without any one of those, the message would not have been the same, right? And then it was also open for interpretation, for you and I to think about what the different parts of that dance meant. And that's how I see culture, language, and literature. So we have some minutes left. I'm very eager to answer questions. I'll look in the chat, first of all, to see if there are any questions. How does vernacular influence English language? Is it important to understand the vernacular first to master the foreign language? I don't know that it's important to master first. I think once you begin learning the language, that the vernacular could be important, depending on if your use of the language. Are you learning it to read literature? Are you learning it to go to another country? So I think vernacular is important, but I don't necessarily think that it needs to be first. Were there other questions there? Thank you, Dr. Patel, for your comment. I don't see any other questions, so you can we can just open it up to asking questions verbally. So along with books, movies, to portray an amalgam of language, literature, and most importantly, culture. What do you think, Vicki? Yes, I think movies are very important these days. because some people need to see things. Some people are much more visual also. Yes. And understanding some culture even before you watch the movie could be important, or afterwards. I know after I watched that movie, The Namesake, I wanted to learn even more about Indian culture. Yes. Okay, so Dr. Patel said he posted a question about turn taking. Turn taking is something I teach in speaking, and I don't know, I'm looking for his question. I don't see his question, but I will say this about turn taking, and that is that I teach that in communications class. Oh, here. As for turn taking, different cultures have different patterns of interruptions and non-interruptions. For example, interruptions are okay in Indian TV debates. So you have 5 or more people talking together. How about, well, I think that as far as debates go, there are always rules, and every debate team has their different rules. So I mostly teach interruptions during conversation, but there are interruptions in debate, but I think that you need to go by the rules of whoever's putting on the debate. Okay, any other questions? You can ask me anything. Anything except my age. I don't tell my age, but I'll answer any other question. Farheen, do you have a question? How about some, maybe if you turn on your video, I could actually get a picture. That would be nice. Could I get a picture of everyone? If you turned on your video for just 10 seconds. Okay, there's the principal. There's Professor Patel, Anita, 2 Anitas. And I'll answer that next question after the picture. So, because I promised people they wouldn't have to keep their videos on too long. So there is another question, but I'll answer it after the picture. So I'll count to 3 and then I'll take a picture. Hopefully some of you can turn your videos on. 1, 2, don't forget to smile. 3. All right, second page. Oh, nobody has their video on in the second page, so I won't take a picture, but all right, so the next question was, do you think that the routine of culture kills the interest of literature? I'm not sure what you mean by the routine of culture, because I find culture rather dynamic, but then there are some routines. Yes, you mean like some rituals and things like that? Is that what you mean? So no, anyway, whichever way you mean the routine of culture, no, I don't think it kills the interest, because I don't think culture is very routine. Myself, that's my opinion. It's my humble opinion. Okay, then there was something else in the chat. I'd like to hear your comment on the mutual inclusivity of language and expression itself, and how the context plays the biggest role in determining this relation between them. Oh, that's a really very good, not exactly question, but I do want to comment on that. Okay, so Agad is saying, I would like to hear your comment on the mutual inclusivity of language and expression. I think that expression is included in language, and I think that context is, I don't want to say everything, but context is overarching, right? And so context is important whenever we're expressing something, whenever we're speaking about something. When I teach communications, or probably more so in academic, but we have to look at the register. We have to look at the audience and the roles that they play, the role that the speaker plays with the audience, the subject and what they're trying to do, the function of that subject. Are they trying to persuade or narrate or describe? So context, I think, is very important. Is it the biggest role in determining its relationship between language and expression? Maybe. I never thought about it, whether it was the biggest role, but I would have to say context is a very big role. I have to think about am I going to say to you the same thing that I would say to one of you privately, individual? Or am I going to, so context is really important. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Anything else? We have time. We have a couple more minutes. You're welcome, Agad. Okay, I'm going to put in my language center. Let me see if I can look at my, okay, language center at SJ. So I'm going to put in my language center at SJCW, no, language center dot sjcw@gmail.com. This is my email that is doesn't get lost in the shuffle of all my students. So I would use my language center email if you do come up with another question that you would like to ask me. Or you could also use Vicki Hale at St. Joseph's College, but if you have any other
query.
Yes. Good.
For that, ma'am, thanks for your unwavering attention throughout your presentation. Loved a lot. Thanks for the well-researched talk you gave today. Well, my question is, ma'am, you were talking somewhere in the context of direct and indirect.
Direct and indirect.
India and you, yes. So I just wanted to ask you, how did you deal with this cultural difference?
Okay, that's a good question.
Also in India.
Okay.
So how did you deal with this cultural difference?
Okay, so I saw that Indians are more indirect in their feedback giving, especially if it's negative feedback. So, and I've already learned to do this, but I think that I didn't do it enough. I always preface my feedback with something positive because there's always something good that somebody has done or something somebody has said or something that I learned. So I always preface with some positive feedback. But I'll be honest, I try to soften my indirect feedback. I want them to know, now I want to give you something now that is real, that will help you in your future presentations. It's not meant to be criticism, it's meant to be constructive. So I preface with words that soften it a little bit. And I think that it's easier for, especially the younger they are, right? The younger they are, the undergraduates perhaps. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
All right. Anything else? I hope you enjoyed. I hope that you, I know for some of you, my accent is new and different. And so maybe it was a little bit, I tried to speak slowly, but I hope it was beneficial and interesting and you're inspired by it. And I just want to thank all of you for having me. And it was a great pleasure and privilege. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Do we have any other queries coming up? If no, let's now move on to to my colleague, Sasmita Swine, for vote of thanks. Ma'am, I guess she is unable to unmute it. There is a technical issue. Can we do it?
Yeah, I just did.
Thank you.
We still can't hear you, Sashmita. So you're not muted on our end, so it's something with your mic. I'm going to go ahead and